There have been a ton of reroll comps floating around the PBE, and I got very curious about a Star Guardian Supers reroll because, as you can see right here, the traits synergize very well together, which is awesome, but in practicality, does it actually work? That's what we need to find out. So in one game, I kind of started figuring this build out, and then I decided to go for it, but it was already a little bit too late based on how the build works, which I'll get into in a sec. So the next 5 games, I basically forced this every game, and I'm going to tell you exactly what the outcomes of those games were, and then as well what I learned about this build, what the pros and cons are, when you should actually go for this because it can be very strong, when you definitely should not, and then some of the things that go into the build, such as items. I'm also going to show you the one scenario where the damage ends up being absolutely insane. So make sure you stick around to watch this crazy damage calculation because I think that this is why the build can be so weak, because in this exact scenario, it is so much damage that I don't think they can really buff it any more than it already is. So let's start with the pros and cons of the build. The pros, when you hit this build, it is very strong because the synergies are so specific. It can really carry you through the early and mid game if you start to hit those synergies well, get the proper items, and it can carry you into the late game. One game I played, I had near perfect. I wish I would have recorded that one, but I ended up getting second, and it was so much damage. There was actually, on my damage chart, Lux did 20,000 damage. I used her as my carry. So a 1-cost reroll did 20,000 damage in the late game. That is unreal. It's very easy to itemize, and it synergizes well when you hit all those units. So it's a pretty simple comp to understand. You only need 1 and 2 cost units, maybe some 3 costs down the line, but it's a pretty basic reroll board. So that's another big pro. Cons, if you don't hit what you need to, and if you don't 3-star at least 3 of the units, it is very lackluster. Another con is if you don't hit some really good units to carry you through that early game, you are going to struggle a lot and take a lot of damage. Now, in the game that I just mentioned where I went second, I actually went down all the way to 25 HP, and then I ended up dominating because I had, the perfect comp, perfect augment. And so it didn't really matter, but that's not always the case. You can beat most boards. And then if there's that one that still annihilates you, you face them twice and you're still out of the game. So you don't want to lose too much HP. And then the last con of this one is, unless you get really lucky on 2-starring a lot of the 6 units that you need, it's kind of hard to push level 7 and 8 effectively, which in the late game, even with a strong 3-star 1 and 2 cost board, you still do need to hit that level 7 and 8 to get some of those stronger units and those synergies. So again, if you have to spend too much gold re-rolling, that's where it can become a little bit of a problem. So you're probably wondering, if there's such drastic pros and cons, when should you actually play this build? Well, I think I've already got that figured out based on the state of the PBE right now. So when you definitely should build this, or at least consider going for it, is if early you get a lot of Lux, Gangplank, Yuumi, Lee Sin, Malphite, Rel really early. As long as you get, a couple of them 2-starred really early, I think you can make a case to push for this build. If you get a hero augment, either damage or support for any of the main 6 champions that I'm going to put up right here, these are the 6 champions. There's no other options. If you can get a hero augment for one of them, that will significantly increase the viability of your build. And then when you absolutely should consider playing this is if at 2-1 you get the damage, Lux, or Yuumi augment, because that is the exact augment that I got for Lux when I got that second place. She was doing 20k damage. It is unreal. So that's kind of a really good way to keep this one in your back pocket. If you see those augments early, you have some of these champions, you can absolutely dominate with this build for sure. As I mentioned, I was going to tell you about the 5-game placement. So the first time I got second place, then I got 4th 3 times, and then I got 8th, but I was hard forcing it and I should not have, but I was just determined to keep playing it until I learned all the ins and outs. So that one, again, it's going to be in my next point of when you should not go for it. But yeah, I think that it really is a top 4 type of comp, as long as you play it correctly. There is a couple scenarios where you absolutely do not want to force this because you will get 7th or 8th place, and I'm going to tell you those right now. So if your early hero augment, let's say on 2-1, or at the very latest, the second round of augments, it does not include one of the 6 champs for this comp, I say go with something else. You can do a different reroll. You can do, just Star Guardian if you're already building that way, but do not go for the Super Star Guardian reroll because you probably don't want to waste a hero augment because you're relying on 1 and 2 cost units. Late game, if you are going without an augment, that is bad news. That's one thing I've learned just from playing any build is if you don't use the champion that you get an augment for, you're basically down an augment, and that's obviously going to make you weaker. If there's a lot of people contesting the supers or any sort of reroll build, Yuumi, Gangplank, anything like that, you might want to consider not building this because you do need to 3-star ideally all 6 of the units, but at least 3 to 4 of them at the very minimum. So if you feel like you can't do that, I would say, maybe stay away from this one. So as I mentioned, this comp is a little bit not flexible because it requires 6 very specific champions. The only time that you maybe could switch it up a little bit is if you get an augment that allows you to put a Super's Crown on someone, and then you can ditch probably the Gangplank since he doesn't really synergize as well, or maybe even the Malphite, although Malphite and Yuumi synergize really well together. So you could maybe switch it around a little bit if you get that specific augment, but again, you would need to know that very early in the game. Or if you don't want to synergize the 3-star Guardian, but I find that you need your Yuumi or Lux to cast as many times as possible in the match. So I think that one is a no-brainer, but I think you could maybe ditch Lux or Yuumi and go with a second defender. And especially if you get, like, let's say the damage augment where you maybe don't need the mana, you just need to hit the burst, then I think you could possibly switch it around. But otherwise, these 6 units just are what I would recommend if you're going to go for this build path. You're going to want a lot of AP items. I really like Archangels on this build because of the 3-stars. If you do get proper tank items, you can really stall for a long time, and the damage does really start to ramp up with Archangels. So I would definitely prioritize that. I do think that Blue Buff and Jeweled Gauntlet can really work well together as well, especially because Lux can target units that are so far away, and Yuumi will always target the furthest units that are away from her. You can get some lucky crits and then, reset with that blue buff. Tank items, I definitely think that you have to go with the standard tank items, but probably I would go Sunfire over Bramble unless you have a lot of duelists or recon boards that are all building crit. The burn on the Sunfire is just very helpful, and it can start burning down some of those units so that your backline can finish everybody off, basically. You don't really want AD items here, so what I usually do is if I do get some AD components, but I have a board that's working really well, then sometimes I'll build Giant Slayer or I'll build the Jeweled Gauntlet just to use up some of those AD items. You can also build Shojin, which does work well, especially when you get the Star Guardian synergy online. So I wouldn't shy away from those items because they are good, but they're just not optimal. But then if you're getting way more AD items, there's not really somebody that they go well on. So you might have to get creative there, but overall it hasn't been a problem so far. Okay, now we need to talk about this insane damage calculation. So as I mentioned, in the game that I got second place, I got the Lux damage augment, and basically what that augment does is it makes every second cast that Lux does do 180% damage. In that game, I also had all 6 of the units 3-starred, And if you read in the Super's description of the trait, for every 3-star in your party, you get an extra 5% damage on top of the 20% that you get just from having supers active. So that's 50%, plus every single cast is 180%. And then I also had a Giant Slayer. So any unit that has over 1600 health does another 30% damage on top of that, which late game is almost everyone. So in a few of the battles, I got 15,000, 18,000, and 20,000 damage just by Lux, which is unreal. I haven't even seen that in some of the other games with my 4-cost carries that were absolutely dominating the board. So I don't know. I think that there is something there with this one. I think because you have to have all 6 of these units, and ideally 3-starred. I don't know if this will ever become a meta comp, but it might be a good one to learn, because if you happen to hit that augment early with these units, it might be a surprise first or second place in the lobby, and it might be one of those clutch builds that you just pull out of your back pocket. But who knows, maybe if there is another variation of this that also works without activating the Star Guardian trait, maybe it will become more of a early game reroll comp that people will actually go for. But super high damage, super hard to hit, so I don't think it's a comp that you could default to or force every single game by any means, but it's good to know about it. Again, we're in the PBE, so there's lots of changes. Have you done any awesome other reroll builds? I know there was the Talon reroll build and the Yasuo Fiora. I didn't really love the Yasuo and Fiora one. I did well with it a couple games, but not my favorite. But have you done any reroll builds that have worked that you haven't really seen any videos on? If so, let me know in the comments. I'd love to try them out. Like and subscribe. Obviously, that helps me out, and we'll see you at the next video.